Hi everyone, my latest guest is Brandon Carter. Brandon is the author of Spark in the Inferno, which is the first book in the Circle of Origin series. Brandon, tell us a little about yourself.
Hello. I am Brandon Carter. Will say I'm good at many things, master of none, jack of all trades, I guess you could say. If you ask my wife, she would say that I am a serial hobbyist. But writing is one thing that has basically always stuck with me. I've been working on this series, we could probably say most of my life. Up until about a year ago, I was never really brave enough to actually sit down and do anything major with it. So Sparking the Inferno was the culmination of that bravery. I'm a health coach. I own my own business in Oklahoma City. I have a little nutrition club called Peak Nutrition. I just help people have a community where they feel safe enough to get together, be honest with one another, and help each other achieve their goals.
Spark in the Inferno, I read,
Mm.
a couple of months ago now. I think it's fair to say that it's pretty original. One thing I find with fantasy is sometimes the plot lines are huge in scale, but sometimes convoluted. I think Game of Thrones was a good example of that. I thought your book was kind of refreshingly simple. We don't really see kings and emperors and battles.
One of the things that I've always struggled with is understanding other people, and I've done everything in my power to learn how to understand myself and apply that to people at large. I wanted to pick a small number of people and make them unique. I didn't want to overwhelm myself with that. Right? And to go back to your Game of Thrones comment, it's like you jump into that first book. I can't remember, I read it, what the name of that one was. There are so many people. It is almost impossible to follow what's going on and remember who everyone is and get a feeling like they're all unique characters. And that drove me nuts. Now, granted, the story is good, but it's just too much. And as for the no large scale battles, no giant, like world sprawling stories, no kings, no queens, that kind of stuff, the average person isn't one of those things. As a reader, I always found it hard to identify with these characters that have this runaway princess or prince in disguise or just worrying about kings running their territories. I'm like, no, the average person is just a guy trying to exist, doing normal everyday things. So take the average Joe, a child who has been through an abusive home life, who struggles with, whether or not he has any sense of self-worth, and put him in danger. And that's the kind of story that I want to write about and the kind of character that I might have an easier time identifying with.
I completely agree, and I don't want us to start to sound like a sort of Game of Thrones slagfest, but that is one of their shortfalls, is that the characters aren't relatable. They're on my shelf, and I had to check. The first book is just called A Game of Thrones.
Oh, is it? Is the first one in
It's-
Game of
yeah,
Thrones? Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's a good segue into characters, because despite you saying that you think you struggle with writing characters, I think that was one of the real strengths of Spark in the
Thank you.
Inferno. It was one of the few books I've ever read where you could remove the dialogue tags and you would still know who was talking. They even have a distinctive speech pattern, even the talking cat, which brings me to that topic.
Everybody's favorite.
Firstly, Adux, is that the pronunciation?
Phoenix, yep.
I did want to see a rant that he's not French.
No, yes, no, he's not French.
It's not Adu.
It's not Adu, God. Regardless of what the community might tell you, I was raised on Dragonlance, Forgotten Realms books, that kind of stuff. And as a kid, I got pretty heavily into, and I'm going to say his name probably wrong, but Dritz Dwarden. He was a drow elf ranger, and he had a magical pet panther called, again, probably going to butcher this too, so I apologize to the listeners, Gwenhwyvar. It didn't talk, but it was a cat kind of familiar companion. And that's kind of what started it. The talking thing, I needed someone for Nevin to talk to because in the beginning of the story, it's just him. I wanted him to feel isolated, but I couldn't have him just walking around talking to himself. Adix was also a good way for to get a little levity in this in the situation, but also to provide a sort of childlike hope that Nevin doesn't really have. It sort of amazed even me how well the community took to him because if you ask my wife says, Adix is me. My mother says, Adix is me. Everyone who knows me and reads it says, that's Brandon Carter right there. Like I don't get it, but I'll take it because he's awesome.
I think initial sort of very shallow interpretation is that he's the comic relief. He does become so much more than that. There are moments in the book where they're separated. I think for me that's some of the hardest hitting emotional moments, when Nevin doesn't know where Adux is. That's when you realise you actually really care about this talking cat.
He's kind of got the whole idiot savant thing going on. He's very clear on certain things, and on other things, he's just, it doesn't make sense. I'm a cat. It doesn't really matter.
Now, I don't think there was ever an explanation as to why Adix talks.
There is a reason for everything. Like I said, I've been thinking about this book for 30 some odd years. I'm very hesitant at the moment to say how many books there are going to be in the series. But let's just say every single one of them is planned out. I know what's going to happen in each one. I try not to do anything without a reason. Now, whether that reason is super genius or absolutely stupid, that remains to be seen. But there is a reason for everything, and it will all come up as the story unfolds.
So there is a reason. You're not telling us. Fine, fine. Don't want to know anyway.
Fine.
I found the magic system quite interesting in the sense that it was restrictive. A lot of magical elements in story they can just sort of run away with themselves. It almost creates plot holes if your magic system's too powerful. Yeah. The Harry Potter books are one of the best examples of that, where there are so many spells and enchantments, and further down the line you're like, well, why didn't you just do this? You did it in the last book. Whereas the magic system in your book is difficult. I think that's the main thing I took. It's difficult to cast magic.
It's easy for it to just overrun your world and your story and just be able to do everything. I don't want my magic to be a solve-all tool. Sometimes you need a sword, sometimes you need a spell, sometimes you need the power of words. Magic needs to have a cost. I hesitate to go too deep into this because the next book is going to be very strong into magic. The problem with this book was it was meant to be an introduction. I don't know how you felt about where it ended.
The ending was very much the end of a first book. It answered a few questions, but it left enough open that you want to read the next one. It did wrap up the Nevin versus Shadow Nevin. I suppose that was in a sense the main storyline. It wrapped that up relatively nicely.
The magic part, there just wasn't a lot of opportunity to really talk about the depth of it because of that wasn't the issue we were dealing with.
You would have potentially run the risk of overworld building. It should be relevant to the plot. A lot of fantasy authors can fall into. I mean, I think it's easy to fall into because world building is fun, isn't it?
Working on it, you just want to show it off.
I'm going to talk about the slightly contentious one, Benched. What a villain. Possibly the best villain I've read in an indie book. I loved that kind of vanity. You know, it sounds strange, but being shallow gave him depth. Sounds like a strange thing.
That. That's a soundbite. I love that. Wow.
A lot of the time we have villains who are out for revenge, but you don't really believe their reasoning. It was Finch that was just, we established early on how vain he was and how much it sort of loved his looks. Then we see that taken away. So that leads to, why didn't we get more of Finch?
I try and make everything in the book work for the direction that I'm going. I'm happy you asked because I put a lot of thought into this. This first book, of course, is Nevin's journey into his battle with himself almost. A lot of great stories focus on integrating the shadow, which, man, if that's not on the nose for this story. Have you ever seen the show Vampire Diaries?
I don't believe so.
Vampire Diaries is a story about a high school girl who two male vampires, their brothers, come into her life, and she falls in love with the good one, and then the bad one comes in, and he's the bad boy. But everybody who watches that show loves the bad boy. That's because he has integrated his shadow into himself to the point where it's like, hey, these bad parts, they're a part of me. I don't shun them. The first part of the journey in Sparking the Inferno is very much a physical one for Nevin. It's fleeing, it's dealing with the sword, it's getting in fights, having a physical, actual villain character. Whereas the second half of the story is more of an emotional, mental one. It's dealing with himself and, what he's capable of. Vinct wasn't necessary. Plus, I thought it would be really funny to off the villain early before anyone else thought that it was time.
I am 99% of the time entirely against sort of resurrecting characters, but you could make an exception. I'm just saying.
I got better villains coming. Hopefully, we'll see what you think when the next book comes out, because hopefully I'll distract you with that story and you'll forget about him.
I'll forgive you one day, I'm sure.
Haley never will, though. That's for sure.
If you do get rid of a character and no one cares, that's a bad sign. That's just a sign.
If I can kill off one character every book that someone cares about, I think I'm doing my job.
I'll touch on something that was only a small part of the book. Creature design? You get what I'm saying?
I get what you mean, yeah.
The breathers and the cave monsters. It feels to me like there's a strong horror influence.
There definitely is. I am a horror fiend. I also believe that books should be more than one genre. They should have elements of different things when it's appropriate. I'm going to tell you, so we've got a book coming out in September called Mosaic. It is a short story collection from multiple authors and multiple genres that The proceeds to all go toward charity. Rooms to Read, if I remember correctly, which is basically helping getting books into kids' hands. And the short story that I sent in is the backstory for the event that killed the Baron's father and moved on to create the Breathers. You're gonna have to wait to learn a little bit more about that for when that comes out in September. But the Churich magic has a warping effect. It changes people who use it. By wizards that use it, they get enhanced life. They don't have to eat or drink as much. They don't sleep as much. It changes them. Particularly concentrated pools, they warp life. I looked at where we were and I thought, well, what would be in that area and how would it be warped necessarily to survive? And the Churich were kind of born from that pale, crab-like monstrosities that live in caves of their own creation.
What I loved is that they melt rocks with their screams. Firstly, that's bonkers, but also terrifying. We have characters getting into tunnels where it's too small for the monsters to come through. Doesn't matter, they're just going to scream until the rock until the hole gets bigger. I loved that so much thought and effort went into such a relatively small part of the book. The Breathers are sort of people who were corrupted by dark magic and run around on all fours with sort of face masks on.
They have to
That's
wear face
creepy.
masks because if they don't, their jaw is kind of like distended.
We will wrap up for 10 minutes and we'll go away, we'll get a wee cuppa, and
Oh,
then we'll jump back in. I think
oh,
a wee cuppa.
a wee cuppa. I love that. Oh, hey, I wanted to show you this while I was thinking about it. Check it out.
That is fucking awesome.
Right? My mom actually had this made for me of all things, and I'm like, it's kind of growing on me. I'm not gonna lie.
It's like the best kind of merch as well. Someone who doesn't know won't think anything of it. But someone who knows.
I'm waiting for someone out there to like recognize it, but I'm not well known enough for that ever to happen. So we'll
You
someday
don't.
maybe.
Theus.
Mm.
Theus is interesting for sort of the opposite reason of with Finch. Finch, we had like a really rich backstory. Theus, we really know very little about.
Theus is by design a character cloaked in darkness. I mean, not just metaphorically, but literally. I hate to say this, but he is designed to kind of at the beginning come across as a Deus Ex Machina. He is one of the strongest swordsmen around. He has some unique capabilities, but you know nothing about him. He's actually the first character I ever created. To this day, my very first email address is Theus_Bane at. He's kind of initially based off of Drizzt Do'Urden. Of course, I grew up with him. But there was another character in, I want to say, the second Terry Brooks novel in the Sword of Truth series. And I couldn't tell you his name, but he was a dark warrior that was really strong, and he ends up facing down his darkest foe and dying. It made a mark on me, but for as little as we know about Theus in the story, I will make you this promise. He is one of the most integral characters to the overarching story, and it's going to take a while to get there.
The question that every author hates. When are we getting a second book?
That's a good question. I'm in the process of writing it now. I like to take my time. I do things backwards, where everyone gets online and they write the book and they're so excited because they're making such good progress, and then they get to the end and then they spend like 6 to 8 months editing. That's not me. By the time I get to the end, I might have a month of editing because I have such a good understanding of the story. I just want to get everything to line up as I go. And then once I get to the end, really, it's just about stylistic choices, fixing words that I leave out because I'm terrible about leaving words out. And then just kind of connecting the end to the beginning is something I'm really big on. And I know that doesn't answer your question at all. I'm hoping to get this next book out by the end of this year. That might be a little overly ambitious. I really want to make sure I deliver a good product and a good story. I think the ending is going to be a little bit, I think I'm going to make some enemies.
That probably means a cliffhanger, doesn't it? You're going to leave us hanging.
Well, I mean, as if there hasn't been one in the first book, but I'm definitely going to, but I will say this, the cat is safe, because if I don't promise that, there will be rioting in the streets.
I would be showing up at your door with a pitchfork and a torch.
Yeah. My wife would divorce me, so I can't do that.
It's a reasonable response, if you ask me. You mentioned that you had another book in the works, which is not a sequel.
I wrote a personal development book. Okay, so the name of the book, I'll announce it, is It's Making a Man in the Mirror, a mildly offensive guidebook. I have this theory. Not everybody is a nail. You use a hammer on a nail. Some people are screws. Some people are bolts. You gotta tailor your approach to the person. If you go after everybody like they're a nail, you're going to mangle them. Some people are going to do really well with personal development books that take the time and are nice and explain them very thoroughly. And then other people, you kind of got to just be a little bit of a jerk and tell them they're being stupid. That's kind of the tact that I take in this. Because I was a little worried about that, I actually reached out to another member of our community, Darren Miller, author of the amazing Dwayne Morrow series. I actually invited him to read it and write me a preface if he felt like it was something he could put his name to, and he did.
Between my first and second book, switched from adult sci-fi to sort of young adult fantasy. I thought
Oh,
that was a bold shift in genre, but you went right outside of fiction. That's
I did.
bold.
I did want to point this out. When my new book comes out, Making a Man in the Mirror, anyone who buys it from my website, if they ask me for it, I'm going to give them the first 5 chapters of the new book as a bonus. I want to touch on something you said earlier about Adix, because he comes up an awful lot in the community. There are a couple of places in the book where me, the author reading it, gets choked up. They're all having to do with Adix. I don't know what it is about that character. Yeah, I'm the author, but I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just freaking just throwing things out there and hope they stick, you know? Like,
I see there been 2 reasons. I think the first is as a character, he's quite innocent, naive even. But I think the other is just purely on the basis that he's an animal. We've all had a pet. We've all loved that pet more than any
I
human.
agree. And we've all wished at one point or another that that animal could say something to us.
When your pet's a cat, it's probably for the best that it can.
Let's say that Adix is not necessarily representative of the vast majority of the cat population. I feel like most cat populations would be much more murderous and vindictive.
There's one question I ask everyone because it's my thing. What's your favorite dinosaur?
I know this one because like it's important to me too. It's easily Diplodocus. First of all, it's basically like a brontosaurus, but it's longer. And in fact, it's the longest dinosaur in existence, so long that its scientific name is Longus, Diplodocus longus. Like, that's just cool. And, they seem pretty friendly. Like, I feel like I could be friends with the Diplodocus.
They have a magnificent tail whip ability, and I think it was ultimately disproved, which was quite disappointing. But there was some research that suggested that their whip could have broken the sound barrier and created a sonic boom.
That's cool to imagine.
I am curious if it's the longest dinosaur. I'm going to fact check you on that one. No, it's not, I'm afraid. No.
What?
Argentinosaurus is now considered the longest dinosaur.
Oh, they updated it? I'm
Well,
not changing it. I'm Diplodocus for life.
the Diplodocus was always very sort of longitudinally laid out.
Yeah.
Whereas Argentinosaurus, although it's huge in terms of weight, it was always much, much bigger than Diplodocus. It's got more of an upright neck, so it wasn't entirely unbelievable that Diplodocus might still be longer.
You're in a different league, my friend. My God, I'm playing in the minor leagues over here, and you're just like an Argentinosaurus.
But Diplodocus, classic choice. It brings back memories of walking with dinosaurs. It was a BBC documentary.
I don't know that I've ever
guess you
seen
would
that.
call it. It was big here. It's like a nature documentary, but with
Okay.
like sort of CGI dinosaurs. But it's filmed and narrated like a David Attenborough documentary.
Oh, cool.
A little outdated now because it was 15, 20 years ago now.
Which means it still probably has better graphics than Jurassic Park, which came out before that. That movie is absolute wizardry.
It's one of the few movies of that age which absolutely stands up. Practical effects is what makes it. A lot of people sort of complain about the raptor design and they're like, oh, they were never that big. I entirely forgive them being that big because part of the reason they were so big is so they could fit someone in the suit so they could do practical effects instead of CGI.
Forgiven. Yeah.
V for Vendetta.
Yes.
I had never watched it.
Oh my God.
That was my weekend research. And
You watched it,
what
right?
movie? So
Oh
good.
God.
And I think what's interesting, your side of the Atlantic, is that it still resonated because here it still feels very relevant. It's such a good reflection of the direction that British politics seems to go in.
Strong female character that's not useless. Hugo Weaving as V. Hugo Weaving, just absolute amazing. He's a hero without being heroic.
Watching the Houses of Parliament being blown up was oddly satisfying. Can I post that? Will this get taken down?
You know what? Hey, you can edit it out later. It's fine.
I'm going to have a van outside my house with a satellite dish on the roof. I don't know why it took me so long to get around to it. I think strangely, and maybe this is probably more of a marketing issue for the movie, it never struck
No,
me as something I was that fussed for. I
you're
never.
absolutely right. I saw it as a kid on accident. We had gone to the movie to see Ultraviolet back in the day, which terrible movie. And it was bad enough, and we had enough free time that we just hopped movie theaters. And the only movie that was playing that lined up perfectly was V for Vendetta. We'd never heard of it. We didn't know what it was. We're just like, well, it's playing. I mean, we may as well go see another bad movie. And it was just amazing. So it just became a part of me at that point.
We can go anywhere in time. Where would you want to go? I got a little bit of a vague response for you, so let's elaborate.
What did I say?
You spoke about sort of what we would consider prehistory. Now, I think when you say prehistory, what you mean is sort of early classical history, I guess.
Before the pyramid.
Babylon, that kind of thing. That's a really interesting period in time.
Did it really flood? Was there like this really crazy worldwide flood? I don't know, maybe. Was Atlantis a thing? Because they have the Rishad structure or whatever that's in the northern Sahara that kind of lines up with early descriptions of Atlantis. And did something happen? Was there a meteorite? Was there a volcanic explosion? Did something happen that kind of like set us back?
There is a mysterious element to it because there is around about that time when you talk about sort of society and civilization sort of took a bit of a step back, or at the very least didn't step forward for a
Hmm.
while. It's something that we call the Bronze Age collapse. We don't really know what caused it. A lot of the blame has been put on what's referred to as the Sea Peoples, but again, we don't really know
Yep,
where they came
that's
from,
right.
who they
Yep.
were. But I think from what I've heard is that most people think that they probably took advantage of the Bronze Age collapse or even suffered from it themselves and then
Right.
resorted to sort of pillaging around the Mediterranean. You mentioned the flood. There is a theory which is reasonably well backed up that the Great Flood is effectively a telling of the flooding of the Mediterranean. There is a theory that that's where the story of the Great Flood came from, is it was this sort of oral telling of
Version.
a literal flood. It
It
was
almost
a
has to be at this point. I mean, there's so many different cultures that talk about it, and they all have kind of a vague agreement over when it happened. There's got to be some truth to it.
North America had a great flood event. Whether humans saw that or took note of that, I couldn't say. Let's say I was to land in Oklahoma tomorrow. If I can only do one thing, where do I go?
If you're going to come to Oklahoma City, you're going to go to the bombing memorial. I want to say it was April 19th, 1995. Timothy McVeigh parked a van out in front of our federal building downtown. 9:02 a.m. it went off, exploded, blew off half the building, killed a bunch of people. It was terrible. I was in my 7th grade math class 15 miles away and the windows shook. My mother was a Oklahoma City police officer at the time, and she went down there and worked and basically helped search the building for survivors. When everything was all said and done, they salvaged what they could. They built a museum and they built this serene, just rectangular pool. Put up these little, the best thing I put is a glass chair for each of the victims in this field. And there's a gate on one end and a gate on the other. And I believe it's 9:01 at one end and 9:02 at the other. And then everything in between is what happened. But it's gorgeous. And seeing it early in the morning is absolutely amazing. But there is a tree that grows on the site. And looking at this tree is like no other tree you've ever seen. It's like leaning, it's kind of gangly, it's beautiful, but it's odd looking. And that's because when the bomb went off, that tree got shredded, but it lived and it regrew and it adapted to the damage that was caused. And they take little clippings of this tree and they send them all over the world for different places to grow the offspring of this tree. It's very humbling. It just feels very much larger than life.
It's funny because it's not the only place like that. You know, if you go to New York, you go
Yes.
to see Ground Zero. You
Yep.
go to Austria, you go to see Auschwitz. You go to Amsterdam, you see the Anne Frank house. And I think it's more than just morbid curiosity.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It is about gaining a level of perspective. It's about these stories that you know happened, but there's something deeper about seeing it.
There's a power there.
Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.